So in this breakout, we're really going to be looking at several risk analysis methods for your organization. Specifically, we're going to be looking at risk mapping, heat mapping, root cause analysis. If we do have time, we'll touch a little bit on SWOT analysis. So you may have previously worked for, previously worked with Wyoming Workers' Compensation Risk Management. If you have, you may be familiar with our risk management analysis. So this is a separate presentation from that. We do offer a risk management analysis. So that is an organization specific presentation where we look at your EMR and claim data. So if that is something that you are interested in, that you want to learn more about your organization's policy, we can absolutely do that for you. Let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so the purpose of our presentation today and what we're really covering today is different in that when we're looking at the way that we look at risk, we have qualitative and quantitative. So typically we have a pretty good idea of what challenges and exposures our organizations face. And when you work for an organization, you get a sense of where losses can occur. You're able to identify the weaknesses and get a sense of its culture. So today we're going to go past just identifying our risks and loss exposures, and we're going to be looking at an analysis. And our analysis today will be safety focused. However, you can use these methods here for other loss exposures, such as employee retention or improving brand image. I did see that someone said that they were with Cyber Wyoming, so that's cybersecurity, I'm assuming. So you can absolutely use some of the quantitative information that we have here to map certain cyber risks. But since we're focused on mainly safety here, we're going to be focusing primarily on worker safety. So what are we talking about when we mean qualitative versus quantitative analysis? Well, qualitative is for those exposures that are difficult to identify with traditional statistics. So quantitative, we are using hard values and numbers to measure losses. So this is like a loss run that risk management provides to employers. So a loss run, and we really break down what the medical costs are of a claim. We break down the expenses, the indemnity. It gives you a really good idea as the viewer of this data, where costs are coming from and how a claim matures. And as we get more of that hard data in a loss run, we're then able to use that information to make assumptions. So if we see that there are 10 falls in winter, so we have 10 slips and falls in winter due to ice, we get the sense that our snow removal process needs a bit more work. So that's really where the quantitative is where we have enough information to draw conclusions, and the information that we get is complete and large enough to make those assumptions. But if you work for a small organization or you're dealing with an emerging issue, you can't really use that quantitative analysis because there's nothing to run. You can't really say we have a slip, trip, and fall problem if only one person has had an issue in the last year. So quantitative information can become useless when we don't have a lot of information. And if you're a small organization or there isn't many injuries, you can't expect a loss run to tell you how to manage your risks. So we use qualitative analysis for exposures when we don't have that. So quantitative has a hard scale. So these are, like I said, actual hard dollar amounts, percentages, where qualitative is more relative, using terms like high frequency and low severity. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. So what are some of these? So qualitative versus quantitative examples. Like we talked about previously, the loss run, that is a quantitative information. It provides us claim data and how a claim is maturing over time. We have T-core, net present value, statistical distributions, time value of money. All these are actual hard value, hard money, hard percentages that give us an idea. But like I said, with qualitative, when we don't have that information, this is the tools that we'll be using. So for an example, there's something in the news right now that's been the last few years is the legalization of marijuana. And so if you were a trucking organization or a trucking company that requires your drivers to be sober, how would the legalization of marijuana affect your organization or your safety process? So there's not a lot of data on it because it's an emerging issue. It's a legalization that hasn't happened before. So what you would have to turn to is one of these tools, and you could use the Delphi method, which is a survey that goes out to subject matter experts. So you would ask, maybe a police officer, or you would ask a lawyer, or even like a doctor to get an idea of how marijuana affects the system, what current laws exist, and get an idea of what policies you could put in place for that emerging issue. So qualitative does have its place, especially if we are a smaller organization or we don't have a lot of injuries. So for qualitative, we have to start with a system of prioritization. We can't just arbitrarily assign a risk a score. So again, going back to that slip, trip, and fall, we can't just say, oh, it's a medium risk and call it a day. No, we have to have a system that we are able to classify where an injury falls. And so we use these system of prioritization to have a set of rules to classify our risks. So these are going to be very organization specific, and I can't tell you what industry standards are because each organization is unique. So right now, think about sort of when we're going through this, think about examples for your organization because we'll ask some questions on it, and it's good if you provide some examples from your organization so that way we can kind of have like a little bit of a back and forth on that. So when we're looking here, we're looking at the measurement scales. So this is the first top part. This is where we start. So when you're thinking about these, think about so for critical risk, those are risks that if they occur, they will likely result in our organization dissolving or declaring bankruptcy. So this is the worst thing that can happen to us. So think about something for your organization that if it were to occur, would just be absolutely the worst thing. It's going to affect your day-to-day operations. You may have to reorganize to stay in business. So that's what we mean when we mean a critical risk. So think about that for your organization. For an important risk, these are risks that have a medium to high severity. So they may affect our day-to-day operations. We may have to borrow money to cover the costs of the incident or the exposure. We will likely be able to stay in the business if the event occurs, but again, it's going to negatively impact us. Minor risks are those risks that have a lower severity. They're not going to impact our day-to-day operations. They're typically something that we see happen often, but we don't want to happen often. And we don't normally have to borrow money. We're able to handle the management of those pretty easily. So we can usually determine if a risk falls within a measurement scale by looking at our severity and frequency scales. So you would use frequency here and severity here to determine where one of these would fall at. And so again, this is organization specific. So if you think about high severity, does your organization consider a $100,000 bill a lot? So if you were Apple or Microsoft, you might think, well, that's not very much money. But if you were, maybe a smaller organization, a $100,000 bill could absolutely cause bankruptcy. So if that's the case, then that's a high severity issue. So you would label a high severity as anything above $100,000 is considered high severity. And then you would say, well, anything for moderate severity is anything above 10,000 but under 100,000, and anything below 10,000 is low severity. So just having those, that breaks up essentially where those risks could fall on the measurement scale. So if you think like a slip, trip, and fall, if that person broke their ankle, had to go get surgery, and then the physical therapy that follows afterwards, that could absolutely be a high severity injury. Frequency, very similar. So we're looking at, does it happen once a month? Does it happen twice a month? Are we seeing it multiple times a week? So again, think about loss exposures that exist in your organization. Are you seeing, you know, do you have any risks that you have an example of? So just think about those, and we'll come back to that here in a minute. But we're going to look at our case study. So Sue, she's a confectionery manufacturer founded in 2018. So Sue began her business to produce her famous candy nationwide. Sue has purchased a manufacturing plant in Wyoming. She's procured machinery, hired employees, and set up a workers' compensation policy. So for the first 3 years of Sue's policy, she had an EMR of 1. But this past year, she just got her EMR letter and it's gone up to a 1.5. And if you're not familiar with what your EMR, that's your experience modification rating for workers' comp. So that determines whether you're going to be paying at, above, or below your base rate. So you want a lower EMR. EMR 1 means you pay at the base rate. Anything above that means you're going to be paying more. So 1.5 means she pays about 50% more on her base rate than if she had a 1. So it's a pretty huge increase. So this moves her premium rate from 4% to 6%. So we're seeing an increase of $4,000 on our premium. So 4,000, that's pretty significant increase in insurance for, you know, a small mom and pop shop. So Sue needs to definitely take a look at what's going on here, and we need to figure out what's going on, but there's really not a lot of data. So again, you know, there may only be 2 or 3 claims. So we really don't know where these injuries are coming from or where our problems exist. Just because we don't have a large organization to draw data on. It'd be one thing if we had, like I said before, 10 slip, trips, and falls in winter, and we could say, well, there's the issue. You're not doing snow removal. But here, it's a bit more complicated because we don't have that information to draw on. So she's going to turn to her safety specialist to determine where the losses are coming from and how to prevent them. So if you could kind of just put in your chat some examples of critical risks that you've thought about. Think of you listing the important risks, list the high severity event, and we'll kind of draw on them again as we go throughout it. But if you would just throw something in there that you identified from the last couple of slides, and we'll just keep going. So Sue, she wants to reduce her workplace accidents because our accidents can cause us some issues. Our employees are our most valuable resources. And when we take the time to train, build trust and relationships, we come to rely on them and they come to rely on us. So having someone get hurt or be removed from the workplace is always a hardship we need to seek to avoid. There's also the monetary issues that come with it, such as a rise in our workers' comp premium. We can look at other factors such as our brand image. So no one wants to work for an organization that has a reputation for people getting hurt. We also have to look at their employee satisfaction. People want to go to a job where they feel safe and able to, you know, be able to participate and do their job and then go home. So injury from the machinery, the old printing press had fingers lost all the time. Yep, absolutely. Sue does have machinery that could cause those types of injuries. So Laura, would you say that would be pretty high frequency then for that? Was it happening, you know, every couple months? Did your organization consider it high frequency? Low frequency, but high severity. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, anytime we have like, you know, an amputation or something, it's expensive. It really hurts our, you know, our morale and really affects a person's life negatively. But it's good that's low frequency. That's absolutely good. But that's a good example. So would you classify that then as a minor risk or an important risk or critical? Critical. Okay. And then fire, injured in fires, police injured by restraining people, heavy machinery failure. Absolutely, Don. Do you think any of those could be classified? So like fire, being injured by fires, was that pretty? Did that happen a lot, or was it pretty low frequency? All right, and while Dawn's getting that, we'll jump over to our next slide. So Sue's going to be meeting with her safety specialist, and so they sit down and they do a whole walkthrough of their. Dawn says it's frequent for my best guess. I am new here. Okay, perfect. But yeah, that's kind of what we want to do for this presentation is really just think about your organization. Think about what you're interacting with and what you come day to day with. What is your organization culture consider high frequency? What does your organization consider high severity? Because you do need to have a system in place, and we'll see that here in a little bit. But so Sue, she sits down with her safety specialist, and they've identified several loss exposures. So what they've done is they did risk identification. So they could have done a survey of the employees, they could have done a walkthrough, they could have taken classes, they've basically sat down and came up with a list of common injuries or injuries that they think are going to be specific to their organization. So we'll start at the top, slip, trips, and falls. They are in Wyoming, so we're going to get snow. It's just a fact. So the safety specialists and Sue, they know that they need to have snow removal because of slip, trip, and fall. Cords. So, they're making candy, there's machinery, so there's cords on the floor. That poses a tripping hazard. Substances on the floor, they're working with sugar, they're working with dye, they're working with different chemicals. So anything on the floor can pose a tripping hazard. That's something they've identified. The machinery, so to get the candy to become candy, the machine has to get hot. So if somebody were to fall on it, touch it, they could get burned. Opening and closing the doors. Laura was talking about that a little bit earlier about people getting amputated from machinery. And so there's pinch points that exist. And then the noise pollution. So they didn't recognize how loud it would be inside and on the machinery floor. So they're seeing that, there's a lot of noise pollution. So that could cause hearing loss or hearing damage. They also have delivery drivers. So Sue, they're delivery drivers. They drive the candy out to retail locations. So there's the risk of collisions. That's not something that they necessarily have control over. And we'll talk a little bit about an analysis of what we can do on things where we don't have a lot of control over. And then there's the frequent lifting of the delivery drivers. They got to pick the candy up, they got to put it in the back of the van, they got to take the candy out, they got to carry it in. So that offers a lot of opportunity for strains. Biological, so epidemics, pandemics, chemicals. So epidemics and pandemics, I kind of put these on here to get us thinking about things that are really outside our control. So we can't control when the flu happens. The flu just is going to happen. But when a flu goes through an organization, it could really be detrimental to our business. So what are some ways that you could reduce the flu from spreading from person to person? And then that way you don't have 10 people out, because Sue's a small organization and they're filling orders as they come in. So if Sue loses, 2 or 3 candy makers, they may not be able to fill those orders on time. That causes them to lose money. And then you also have the safety risk side of that, where you don't want people sick. You don't want people that are sick coming in and spreading the illness. That's just, a problem. So are there things in place that they can put in place? Are there policies that exist? So those are some things they've identified. Again, they don't really have any direct control over it, but there are ways to reduce that risk. And we'll get to that in a bit too. And then there's chemicals. So they work with chemicals, there's dye on the floor. They have to use a special chemical to get the dyes up off the floor. There's certain weather events that can affect our workers or cause an injury. There's flooding, fire, snow. And then there's the ergonomic side of things too. People are standing for long periods of time. They're on a concrete floor. It could cause strains, lower back problem. So these are all the risks that they've identified. So they think they've done a really good job identifying the risks, and they have. So could we draw any policies off of this? I mean, kind of, but we really don't know what's affecting us or what's the biggest issue. We can look at this and say, well, they're a small organization, so we can't rely on data. So we can't say, well, there's 10 slip, trips, and falls, but there's like 3 strains. So we need to focus on slip, trips, and falls. There's no data like that. They're small. this is what they've just identified. So we have to have a way to break these things down and look at them. And so some of this is going to rely on some, best judgments or some observations about, other organizations, and you can look at data online. But essentially, what Sue and her safety specialists come up with, they've come up with their system of prioritization. So they look at their measurement scale and they say, okay, anything over $100,000 is the critical risk. If it has that type of tag to it, it's a problem. So car wrecks, fires, floods, all of that could put them out of business. Over 10,000, but under 100,000, that's an important risk. That's going to possibly affect our day-to-day operations. We may have to borrow money to stay in business, and then anything under 10,000 is a minor risk. They have their severity scales. So anything greater than 3 months lost time is high. So they say, okay, if one of our injured workers gets hurt and they're out for 3 months, that was a very severe injury. If they are less than 3 months lost time, but more than 3 weeks lost time, it's considered moderate. It's a problem, but they weren't out too long. And then anything under 3 weeks lost time is considered minor to sue. This may be very different from your organization. So again, think about your organization, think about your culture and what you consider high, moderate, and low. It will be different. An oil field is going to be very different than a law office. So just think about your organization, what you would consider severe injury, and write that down too. So that way you remember it and it's not just an arbitrary number. So then frequency scale, again, occurs more than once a month. Sue says that's high. If it happens twice a month, if we have 2 slips, that's a problem. Occurs more than once every 2 months, that's considered moderate. And then occurs once every 3 months or less is minor. So Sue and her safety specialist, they came up with their system prioritization. So they have an idea where everything's fitting. They also identified their risks. So the next step is we take our first tool, and this is the first qualitative risk analysis tool, and it's called a heat map. So while you're looking at this, one thing you want to be aware of is to always check for spelling issues, because if you're going to present this to your board, or you're going to present this to your manager, you don't want to put in a ton of work and then have misspellings or anything. But this risk map is really effective in identifying and displaying risks. So we get a pretty good sense of where everything's falling on here. This also supports policy changes. So you could take this graphic to your manager or to the person that you're reporting changes to policy to, and you can use it to substantiate. You could say, we're having a ton of noise pollution issues because it's a high frequency and high severity. And then we're able to track reduction results over time and monitor risks over time. So if you're kind of following along a little bit earlier when we were talking about what qualitative risks is, and we were saying it's using a relative scale, you might be thinking, well, this looks pretty hard value to me. So this is where that system of prioritization comes in. So we're able to use our system of prioritization to get an idea of how these risks would affect us. So if we look at cords, so tripping over cords, they may have somebody that tripped over a cord, and then they're able to get an idea of where that falls on their scale. So it's a pretty frequent issue. They have seen people trip on the shop floor. They're absolutely seeing that people can get injured and they have to go to the doctor's office. So it's decently severe. But you want to use that information from your system of prioritization to translate that over to your risk mapping. And it will depend on what your organization determines: high frequency, high severity, et cetera, et cetera. So let's do a little bit of an analysis with this. So first off, we can definitely break up this graph a little bit. So now we're seeing that there's 4 quadrants on it. And then we can break that up. So we say quadrant 1, that's high severity, but low frequency. So we're seeing that if one of these were to occur, it would be expensive. It's up here in our high severity. So that's going to be something that's, like I said, it's going to be fitting that either 3 months lost time, or it's going to be over here where it's over $100,000. So people getting burnt, they may be missing 3 months of work. People who have a chemical burn, they're missing that. Pandemic, they had people that lost time or weren't able to, continue working because of it, or, a vehicle collision. So those are all something where people could be missing 3 months or more of work. Next one we have is high severity and high frequency. So this is something that, again, is occurring often, and it's severe enough that it's a problem where people may be missing 3 months of work. So this is where we can really get an idea of where our problem areas are at. So again, over here, we may not have a lot of control over our high severity, low frequency, because those are typically things that are outside our controls, like floods, fires. But high severity, high frequency, this is usually, we can usually mitigate high frequency by putting different remedies in place. So quadrant 2 is definitely where we don't want to be. That's the no-go area. Low severity, low frequency, this is where we want to be. So pinch points, they see pinch points as an issue. They exist. They haven't had anybody get a pinch point. There's been a few close calls, so that's where they put that. Slipping and tripping on the ice and strains. And then finally, we have low severity, high frequency. So this is where, it's not too bad, but it's happening too much. We need to bring this over here. So noise pollution is the largest workers' compensation risk that they've identified. So what are some remedies? Well, the purchase of hearing protection is going to be the first thing that they need to do. Maybe the hearing protection that they have isn't adequate enough. That's why we're getting injuries. Maybe it needs to be of better quality. But now that they've graphed it, they have an idea of what to look at specifically. So we took a large list of risks and we've narrowed it down to what our problem children are. And our number 1 is that noise pollution. So new policy, they've implemented a new policy that said that explicitly requires employees to wear PPE on site. So anytime you enter that manufacturing room, you have to have your earplugs in. You can't just walk in because you're leaving for the day. If you leave for the day and you go out that door, you got to put your earplugs in. And then they also implement annual hearing examinations just to make sure that people are getting treatment and seeking out help if there is ongoing issues. They also identified the area has multiple slip, trips, and fall concerns. Again, we're seeing those here. So they decide to implement a clean work area before and after each shift. So we're seeing this analysis. So this is analysis, we're talking about the remedies here. These are all remedies. So this is a new policy that they implemented because they've identified, 3 areas of concern. Even though, they're low severity, they're still happening too much. So they implement the clean work area to try to reduce this by removing those floor obstacles. They decide to completely remove the cord one altogether by the use of an overhead extension cord. And then they also have new policies regarding a clean work area. Some of the other loss exposures, so ensuring proper training regarding machine and chemical use, because we want to, we may not have a lot of control over these high severity, but these ones we do. So we can ensure that people are properly trained. They know where if they touch that machine, they're going to get burnt. And then the purchase of masks for a possible pandemic, that's an option. Another option is having a sick policy in place. So if people are not feeling well or under the weather, making sure that they have the ability to take the time off of work that they need, so that way it's not spreading to other employees. And then ensuring defensive drivers, ensuring delivery drivers take defensive driving courses. So again, a collision may be completely outside our control. The delivery driver may just be going through a green light and then they get T-boned by a careless driver. But we can have them take defensive driving courses to try to mitigate that frequency just a little bit more. We may not have much control over the severity, but we can try to reduce that from happening. So this is a risk map. Again, it's a pretty handy tool. It's a lot of art, and it's a little bit of science too. So you do have to use that system of prioritization and translate that to this map. So again, you have to be able to say, well, what are we considering, moderate? So, in here could be something that's moderate between the 40 and 80 range. Anything that's above 80, we're considering severe. Anything below 20, we're saying it's minor. It's going to be organization specific, but it's absolutely doable. And so how do you make one of these maps? Well, I use Python. You can use Excel. You can use paper and pen. You can use any number of different software applications that are out there. There's paid ones, there's free ones, there's Google Slides. But you can see with just a few lines of code, we're able to get a pretty decent map, and Python, is free. So there are resources out there and different ways for you to be creative. So our next tool that we can use, so this was an example of a risk map. So we took those loss exposures we identified and we mapped them, and that gave us a graph. And then that graph gave us the ability to say, okay, we know where these issues are. We know what our problem children are. We can implement policies to reduce their severity and their frequency, saving our employees and saving us money as well. So what we're also going to look at is a heat map. This is a very simplistic heat map. It's super, super simplistic. You have your severity scale here and your frequency scale here. So this is color coded to show criticalness. So if you think back, noise pollution was something we identified that was the problem area for SWO. So we say it's a high, it's a 3, because again, people are missing 3 months of work, and it's probable because we're seeing it happen often enough. So this is where we say, okay, that's a 3 because it's a high, and it's 3 because it's a high frequency. So then that's where we get that. And then pinch points, they're not really likely. People aren't really getting their fingers stuck in there. We do have them, but they're not severe enough that they're too much of an issue. But this gives us an idea, and it's also something that you can use in your report. So if you are somebody that has to make policy change decisions, you can use a heat map for justification and easy to read. Because again, if you just give somebody a list of all your loss stuff, they're not going to be able to say, they're not going to be able to understand your justification as easily if you give them a graph. So this is more of providing, that information in an easy to read manner. And this is also used to make data more actionable. So if we think back on this data isn't actionable because we don't have anything to it. Then when we put, our system of prioritization to it and we get a risk map, this makes the data a little bit more actionable. But if somebody who didn't know what a risk map was looking at, they're not going to be able to say, okay, yeah, I get that a dirty floor is happening a lot, but it's not too severe. As much as this will, because then this really breaks it down for them and gives them an idea like, oh, geez, looking at that red's not good. So let's do a little bit of an analysis with this. So our noise pollution is a 9, indicating to Sue that this is the largest risk her organization faces and likely the reason for her creeping EMR. So again, she went from a 1 to a 1.5. That's a big jump. Both chemical burns and trips from cores require attention. They're also a contributing factor to her EMR. A pandemic is unlikely, however, it could cause large-scale problems for Sue's organization. Excuse me. And so again, this goes back to just because something is, once in a million or once every 100 years doesn't mean it's going to happen once every 100 years. It means it's low frequency. So just because you have a low frequency risk doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that it won't happen very often. So slips on the ice are common enough and severe enough to warrant attention. Trips from floor obstacles are not so severe, but are happening far too often. Burns and strains are both issues, but not too much of a contributing factor. So again, using your system of prioritization, you break these up, and then you're able to then map them on a heat map. Heat maps can be very complicated or they can be very simple. This is just an example of a super easy heat map that you can make using Google Sheets or Excel. And that's what I use. I just use Excel. Again, color is used to indicate high frequency or high severity. And then we use the number to determine the placement on the map. So you go back to your system of classification, you say, okay, this is a moderate severity, it's a moderate frequency, it gets a 2, it gets a 2, it falls right there. Heat maps can be very complicated. So here's a couple of examples of heat maps. I'm not sure where this one came from. It was a free picture that I got with heat maps, but you get a sense of what's happening without ever actually looking at the data. So you know whatever is happening a lot in Europe, and it's severe in Europe. So you can see the frequency, and the larger the dot, the larger the severity, while not so much in Africa. So again, heat maps, they're like the Weather Channel. You get an idea of where storms are coming in and out of. But they're really good for providing information without a lot of context. Here is a kind of an example of a bad heat map. This is a NBA stat graph. And so, you see a lot of red and stuff, but it doesn't really give you a whole lot. You can definitely look at it a little bit within it and get an idea like, oh, well, for Nate, we have G, and that's sort of an orange, but probably not as severe as up here for Devon. All right, so that's how we can analyze our risks. We use the risk map and we use the heat map as ways of supporting policy changes. We use the risk map to determine where we're falling at, if it's high frequency, high severity, and where those are occurring. What we're going to go over now is known as root cause analysis. So we're going over, there's multiple ways to do root cause analysis. We're going over the 5 whys. Essentially, you're asking why 5 times. And we use this to drill down to the root cause of a risk. So we did the heat map, we did the risk map, and so we've implemented some new policy changes. We've taken some steps to ensure that we're being safe and that we keep a safe work area. But then we have another injury that occurs. Why did that happen? So you use a risk map to look at a multiple faceted problem. So there may be multiple areas that need looking at that couldn't be identified by the risk map or the heat map. So we're able to look macro with the 5 whys and then work micro to the issue. And then we're able to view multiple risks at once to determine the cause. So starting off, Jake was taken to the hospital for a slip and trip and fall. So that's a fact. That happened. So he slipped, he tripped, he fell, he had to go to the hospital. That's where we're starting from. So then we say, why? Well, Jake slipped on a cord as he was adding sugar to the mixture. Well, we already know that our cord policy states that cords are to be out of walking paths. We have it in our rule book. Why did that happen? So that's the second why. Jake was on the first shift, so the previous shift would have left the cord. Okay. Why did that previous shift leave that cord? So that's the third why. Previous shift supervisor responsible for area cleanup at the end of the day left for an emergency. So the person who was responsible for ensuring that the cords were picked up at the end of the day left for an emergency. So there's nobody there to ensure that proper cleanup was done. But why was that? And so you get a sense how we ask why. And so we go from a person going into the hospital for a slip, trip, and fall to an understanding where our weaknesses exist within our policies. So the 2 issues are found. We may need a secondary lead to implement in case of emergencies. So somebody on shift that has training in area cleanup to ensure that at the end of the day, our area is getting cleaned up. And then we also need to ensure that morning shift does a walkthrough and does a hazard identification before they start. So we identified 2 weaknesses in Sue's policy. So Sue knew that, you know, cords were an issue. She took steps and by creating new policies for it, but something still happened. But now we were able to identify, well, there was a weakness in our policy. We needed another supervisor there to make sure that area cleanup is occurring, and we need to do a morning walkthrough to ensure that hazard corrections exist before we start working. So that's an example of root cause, 5 whys, very simple. And this is how you kind of do it yourself. Again, you can do it on paper, you can do it, you know, through Excel, you can use any number of formats. But essentially for this, you're asking why 5 times. And you want to base your questions on factual evidence and not opinions. So, you know, we all have biases. And when we look at, you know, an injury, we may think, well, you know, we're providing training. We obviously are. I mean, he signed the paper saying he got trained. So him saying that he wasn't properly trained, that's ridiculous. You have to take it and actually investigate it. If the person's saying they're not properly trained, you know, why weren't you properly trained? How were you properly trained? You really want to dig down to it and not base your evaluation on opinions. You want to get multiple perspectives to ensure that the determined cause and remedies are effective. So you want to make sure that you are getting to the base of the problem, and then you want to monitor it over time to ensure that any remedies you suggest or implement are effective. And then don't rely on assumptions. You know, you may assume that everybody on the floor is trained on how to use machine A, but that might not be the case. You know, so you can't start your 5 whys with, well, okay, Tim was already trained on it. So where do we go from there? Start at the top. Like, Tim, were you trained on this machine? No. Why? And then go from there and figure out where the problem actually occurred. So we are kind of running out of time, so I'm going to blow through this last slide here really quick. SWOT analysis, we're breaking up, you know, an analysis into 3 areas: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you can look at a problem, identify its strengths, identify the weaknesses, determine what opportunities exist for your organization, and what threats could exist that could cause whatever you're planning to fall under. So we use this analysis to evaluate a process or a possible change to a process, and allows us to see the situation as a whole to make a determination. So S, list all of what your organization does well. W, list your current issues such as high turnover. O, what external factors could provide advantages. And then T, possible hardships to the organization. And then Wyoming worker compensation risk managers, we get our training through the National Alliance for Insurance and Education. And so all of our risk managers are certified through the National Alliance or are working on getting their certification through the Alliance. And does anyone have any questions? I know that was kind of a lot of information that all went in at once. You may have questions later on, and if you do, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and just type my email here in the chat for you, and then you can just reach out to me with any questions. And for the recording, my email is steve.jones@wyo.gov.